Morris, thank you very much for joining me for this interview today. I'd like to start by asking you, what does the term adaptive reuse mean?
Adaptive reuse, I think, means different things depending on the project. And I think that we have been involved in a number of projects, both in historic districts and outside historic districts, using buildings ranging from a cooperage at the Wythe Hotel to a coffee and tea warehouse at one of the projects we did in Tribeca, a condominium project. And I think that when we start the project, it's important to understand what the essence of that building is, and then that way we can change or adapt that building to the future needs or what we're designing.
And building on that, I want to ask you, why do you think that's important? Why do we simply not demolish our buildings and build, entirely new purpose-built structures when the useful life of, a building on a particular site has been reached?
We're involved in many projects in historic districts, and in those particular districts, it's, I don't want to say impossible, but very difficult to demolish what is considered a contributing building. And in most cases, we wouldn't recommend that, and we think that there is a better way to use the building stock that we have, and I think that it adds a certain genuineness to a project. And we've done this on projects that are not in historic districts.
Do you see it as entirely different in terms of how you might approach it in the design process, compared with a completely new, if it was a greenfield site, for example? Are there certain differences or more challenges that you're confronted with?
Definitely, there are definitely challenges working in a historic context or specifically with a historic or contributing building. I personally find it more difficult to work in a greenfield site because our process involves really understanding the site, history, and how what we do can fit into that context. The morphological conditions, but also just the historic context of a particular site. And so I like the challenge of working within a context that's loaded with history or some challenges in terms of the forms. But I also think that it's not limiting. I think to a certain extent, I think doing that research and investigating the conditions can be liberating to a certain extent. I think that we've approached many of those projects in very different ways.
My last question to you is there a building in New York that you're very fond of, be it contemporary, be it slightly older, that you could see, if its use were to become obsolete, that one day could also be subject to this kind of change?
Sure. Let me answer it in a slightly different way. And we did another project in Tribeca where we replicated a building, this coffee and tea warehouse that was in masonry, brick and terracotta in metal. Basically made a facsimile of that building, which was a mirror image, which was the exact opposite of what I typically do, which is try to create something that's new and modern, that draws on the history or the context. Whereas this was a literal appropriation. But I think by changing the material and creating that contrast, it was relevant there. But I keep getting the same, or thinking the same thing, is every building a base or a part of some future addition? And I think that it's hard to really think of a city as just being made up of those types of conversions. So I do think that we have to think about that too. I mean, I think that I'm very happy with the work that we have done, and I think it makes sense. But as you see more and more of this, you start to think, is that the only solution? And I think that we do need to create new landmarks, and so sometimes some of these buildings may be not valuable or relevant to keep. So I think that was one part of it. But one of the things I really like about New York is that it has such a range of building stock. And in our office here, if you look out of the window, you see everything from 1970s, office buildings to 1920s deco structures and everything before and in between. So I like to see that diversity. So I think that it's our obligation also to create new architecture. But I still think that an important part of what we do will be reusing our building stock.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.